The iron door stood between them like a century of silence. Her hand trembled against the cold metal, the key heavy as prophecy in her palm. Behind her, the castle held its breath. Before her, in the darkness beyond, something ancient waited. When she turned the lock, the sound rang through stone and shadow like a vow being broken or kept. Before we dive into this story, leave your rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment reach your heart. The rumour began as the whisper of a dying torch. It ran between the servants, climbed the stone corridors, crawled beneath locked doors, and always ended in silence, as if the air itself feared to say more. That night, the castle breathed like a sleeping animal, heavy with secrets, damp with fear. It had rained for days and the gargoyles soaked through seemed to weep over the rooftops. In the basement, where time rotted in chains, a young woman walked with lowered eyes and a body bent beneath the weight of an iron pitcher. No one knew her full name. They called her only Lyra, as if a brief sound could contain her existence. She was one of the castle's slaves, born into anonymity and condemned to disappear within it. With each step, the sound of water dripping from the vaulted ceilings seemed to mark a secret rhythm. The frozen floor reflected the trembling light of torches, and the air smelled of iron, mould, and forgotten memories. Above her, the nobles danced, laughed, and lied beneath the glow of candles. Below, in the depths, the castle kept what no one dared to name. A prisoner who, they said, had been condemned not for crime, but for fear. A man they called Monster, whose shadow still made the lords who chained him shudder. Lyra should not have been there. The key hanging from her neck did not belong to her. It had been found among the rags of a dead servant, the cold metal marked by a symbol she did not understand. Since then, she had dreamed of voices calling her name from inside the walls, voices promising light amid the darkness. And that dawn, moved more by silence than by will, she descended to the limit where light could not reach. The iron doors guarding the prisoner were like a profaned altar. When Lyra touched the bolt, the cold pierced her soul like an omen. The lock groaned, and a dense breath escaped, the exhalation of 10 years without sun. The sound of chains moving afterward was not human. It was the sound of earth opening its eyes. He was there, seated in the darkness, so still he seemed part of the stone, his skin pale as ancient marble, his eyes 2 blades reflecting the torch's flame. When he spoke, his voice came not from his lips, but from the space between the flames. "Who sent you?" he asked, and the air lost its breath. She did not answer. She only lowered her face, and the gesture, more than words, revealed the absence of fear. It was the first silence between them, and in it something moved, invisible and final. In the days that followed, the castle seemed to wake from an iron sleep. The lords began to feel the weight of their sins in the walls. The Duchess, owner of the place and of Lyra's life, ordered the guards reinforced, but the torches extinguished themselves. There were whispers in the corridors, footsteps without owners, and the sound of trapped breathing in empty rooms. Lyra continued her work, eyes low, hands obedient, but something in her had changed. The iron collar that once hung around her neck had become the echo of a choice. The chain that would one day bind her to the floor now connected her, invisibly, to the being she had freed. When the Lord of Darkness, the one called Alpha Vampire, climbed the stairs for the first time, the entire castle bowed to the sound of his steps. No one saw him enter the halls. They only felt the presence like an internal eclipse. The candles leaned, the mirrors fogged. He wore no crown, no armor, only the gaze of one who had already crossed through death. Before him, the nobles forgot words. The Duchess, trembling, feigned authority. Lyra, in the corner, her apron stained with wine and ash, remained motionless. And it was to her, among all, that the man looked. Long, with the attention of one who recognizes something the entire world tried to erase. The tension grew like a contained tide. The tongues of the castle sharpened themselves. They said the slave had awakened the demon, that her blood sustained him, that the castle would be condemned by the insubordination of a servant. Fear became spectacle. Meetings were convened, prayers invented, punishments decreed. Lyra was dragged to the great hall, surrounded by lights and eyes. There stood the throne, empty since the exile of the ancestral lord, and before it, the freed man. standing, wrapped in a shadow that seemed alive. The Duchess accused the slave of treason. The crowd awaited punishment, but the silence that followed was from another realm. He approached. Each step was a blow against centuries of hierarchy. When he stopped before her, the air was no longer the same. He touched the chain still hanging from Lyra's neck, a simple gesture without tenderness or violence, and tore it away, throwing the metal to the floor. The sound echoed like an oath. "Who harms her harms me." That was all he said. The hall filled with murmurs, with fear, with disbelief. The Duchess paled, the councillors retreated, and for the first time in many years, the castle knew what true silence was. That night, the winds changed direction. The windows opened by themselves and the candles burned blue. No one slept. Some fled before dawn carrying gold and lies. Others locked themselves in prayers. And Lyra, now without shackles, walked to the inner courtyard, where the rain was beginning to cease. The sky, grey and immense, seemed to watch. In the distance, upon the towers, the Alpha remained motionless, like a statue reminding the world of the price of freedom. He did not smile, did not speak. He only looked, and in that look there was a recognition that asked for no answer. That was how the castle changed forever. Some said the slave had freed evil, others that she had freed truth, but no one could say who, in the end, had freed whom. The morning after brought no relief. The castle woke to a silence that felt like waiting, as if the stones themselves had learned to hold their breath. Lyra stood in the kitchen long before the other servants stirred, her hands red from the cold water she used to wash the floors. The work was the same as always, scrubbing, carrying, bowing, but the weight of it had shifted. She could feel eyes on her now, not just glances but stares that lingered, full of questions no one dared to ask aloud. The other servants kept their distance, moving around her as if she carried something contagious. Fear, perhaps, or something worse than fear. She did not blame them. In their position, she would have done the same. The castle had its rules, invisible but absolute, and she had broken the most sacred one. She had touched what should not be touched, opened what should remain sealed. And now, the consequence of that act stood somewhere above her, a presence she could feel even through layers of stone and wood. He was there, the Alpha. The man who had been buried alive in darkness for a decade, who had emerged not as a broken thing, but as something sharpened by suffering into a blade. The head cook, a woman with a face like weathered leather and hands scarred from years of fire, finally spoke. "You should leave," she said quietly, not looking at Lyra as she kneaded dough with violent efficiency. "Before they decide what to do with you." Lyra did not answer. Where would she go? She had been born in this castle, or near enough. Her mother had died in the fields that surrounded it, and her father, if she had ever had one, was a ghost without a name. The world beyond these walls was as foreign to her as the bottom of the sea. She had no coin, no skills beyond servitude, no family to claim her. Flight was not freedom. It was only a different kind of cage. "They are saying you cursed us," another servant whispered. A young girl with frightened eyes who had always been kind to Lyra in small, secret ways. "That you made a pact." "I made no pact," Lyra said softly. It was the truth, though she was not certain it mattered. Truth and belief were different countries, and in this castle, belief ruled absolutely. The girl nodded but did not seem convinced. No one would be convinced. The story was already being written in whispers and glances, and Lyra knew how such stories ended. She would become the villain, the fool, the sacrifice. It was easier that way. Easier to place the blame on the lowest rather than question those who had chained a man in darkness and called it justice. The day passed in fragments. Tasks completed in silence. Meals delivered to rooms where doors closed quickly, as if her presence might contaminate the air. She moved through the castle like a ghost, visible but untouchable, and with each hour, the pressure built. Something was coming. She could feel it in the way the servants avoided certain corridors, in the way the guards stood straighter, hands closer to their weapons. The Duchess was planning something, and when the Duchess planned, people suffered. It was late afternoon when the summons came. A guard, young and visibly uncomfortable, appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You are wanted in the East Wing," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Now." The East Wing was where the nobility lived, where the floors were polished marble and the air smelled of imported oils and old money. Lyra had been there before, but only to clean, to serve, to be invisible. Servants who entered the East Wing and drew too much attention rarely returned unchanged. She dried her hands on her apron and followed the guard, her heart a steady drum in her chest. Not fear exactly, something quieter than fear. Resignation, perhaps, or simply the knowledge that some moments arrive whether you are ready for them or not. The room she was led to was smaller than she expected, more intimate. A parlour with windows that overlooked the gardens, now grey and drowned in evening mist. The Duchess sat in a high-backed chair, her posture perfect, her expression carved from ice. She was a woman who had been beautiful once, and the memory of that beauty made her current severity more cutting. Beside her stood two men Lyra recognized as advisors, their faces arranged in expressions of concern that did not reach their eyes. "Leave us," the Duchess said to the guard, who bowed and retreated with obvious relief. The door closed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things unsaid, of accusations waiting to take shape. Lyra kept her eyes lowered, her hands folded in front of her. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a kind of armor, thin but sometimes sufficient. "Look at me," the Duchess commanded. Lyra raised her eyes. The Duchess studied her with the detachment of someone examining an insect, curious but ultimately indifferent to its fate. "Do you know why you are here?" "No, my lady." "Do not lie to me." The Duchess's voice was soft, almost gentle, and somehow that made it worse. "You opened the lower chamber. You released the prisoner. Do you deny it?" There was no point in denial. "I do not deny it." "Why?" It was a simple question, but Lyra had no simple answer. Why had she done it? Because of the dreams? Because of the key that had found its way to her like a message in a bottle washed ashore? Because something in her had recognized something in him? A kinship of cages, of being kept and controlled and denied? She did not know how to put any of that into words that would make sense to someone like the Duchess, who had never been powerless a day in her life. "I do not know." "My lady," she said finally. The Duchess's smile was thin and cold. "Ignorance is not innocence. You have endangered everyone in this castle. That creature you released is not a man. He is a monster, and you have unleashed him upon us." "He has not harmed anyone," Lyra said quietly. "Not yet." One of the advisors spoke now, a thin man with a voice like dry paper. "But his kind are unpredictable, dangerous. He was imprisoned for the safety of the realm." "He was imprisoned because you feared him," Lyra said, and immediately regretted the words. Speaking truth to power was not courage. It was stupidity. The Duchess stood, her movement sharp and deliberate. She crossed the room until she was close enough that Lyra could smell her perfume, heavy and floral, like flowers rotting in the heat. "You forget yourself, girl. You are a servant. Less than a servant. You are property, and property does not have opinions." Lyra said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Duchess was right, at least according to the laws that governed this place. She was property, a thing to be used and discarded as needed. "However," the Duchess continued, stepping back, "you may yet prove useful. The creature seems to have taken an interest in you. Why, I cannot fathom, but his attachment may provide us with leverage." Understanding came slowly, then all at once. They wanted to use her as bait, as a bargaining chip, as a means to control the Alpha. The realization settled over her like cold water. "You will do exactly as I say," the Duchess said. "You will go to him, you will speak with him, and you will convince him to return to his chamber willingly, or I will have no choice but to take more drastic measures. And if he refuses, then we will see how much he truly values your life." The threat was not subtle. If the Alpha did not comply, Lara would be the one to pay for it. It was an old strategy, as old as power itself. Hurt the vulnerable to control the strong. And there was nothing Lyra could do but agree, because refusal would only bring the punishment sooner. "I will try," she said. "You will succeed," the Duchess corrected. "Or you will suffer the consequences. Now go." He has taken residence in the North Tower. The guards will show you the way. Lyra bowed, a mechanical gesture born of years of training, and left the room. The guard was waiting outside, and he led her through corridors that grew progressively colder as they climbed. The North Tower was the oldest part of the castle, a relic from a time when the walls had to be thick and the windows narrow to keep out enemies. Now it kept out light and warmth, and the air inside tasted of dust and disuse. They stopped before a heavy wooden door. The guard knocked once, then stepped back quickly as if afraid of what might answer. There was no response, but after a moment, the door swung open on its own, moved by no visible hand. Lyra stepped inside. The room was large but sparsely furnished. A bed, a table, a chair, a fireplace that held no fire, and by the window, backlit by the fading daylight, stood the Alpha. He did not turn when she entered, and for a long moment she simply stood there, uncertain whether to speak or wait. "They sent you," he said finally. It was not a question. "Yes." "To convince me to return to my prison?" "Yes." He turned then, and the sight of him in the dim light was startling. He was not monstrous, not in any conventional sense. Pale, yes, with skin that seemed to have forgotten the sun and eyes that held a darkness deeper than mere colour. But his features were human, almost painfully so. It was his stillness that unnerved, the way he stood without the small, unconscious movements that marked living things. He was like a painting of a man, perfect and lifeless. "And will you?" he asked. "Try to convince me." Lyra considered lying. It would be easier, safer. But something in his gaze made dishonesty feel impossible. "No," she said. "I will not." For the first time, something like surprise crossed his face. "Why not?" "They will punish you for failing. They will punish me regardless." It was the truth, and saying it aloud made it feel more real. "If I succeed, I will have betrayed you. If I fail, I will have defied them. Either way, I lose." He studied her in silence, and she felt the weight of that attention like a physical thing. It was not unkind, but it was absolute, as if he could see through skin and bone to the truth beneath. "You are afraid," he observed. "Yes, but not of me." No, that was also true. She did not know why, but she was not afraid of him. Afraid for him, perhaps. Afraid of what might happen because of him, but not of him. "That is rare," he said quietly. "Most people fear what they do not understand." "I do not understand you," Lyra admitted. "But I understand cages, and I do not think you should return to yours." The silence that followed was different. Warmer somehow, though the room remained cold. He moved away from the window, crossing to the fireplace, and with a gesture Lyra did not fully see, flames sparked to life in the hearth. The light transformed the room, casting shadows that danced against the stone. "Sit," he said, indicating the chair. It was not a command, but an invitation, and she found herself accepting it, lowering herself onto the worn wood. He remained standing, one hand resting on the mantel, his gaze on the fire. "You ask me not to return to the dark," he said, "but you do not ask me to leave. Why is that?" Lyra had not thought about it consciously, but the answer came easily. "Because leaving would bring war, and war would kill people who have done nothing wrong. The servants, the farmers, the children, they did not imprison you. They do not deserve to die for it. And those who did imprison me, what do they deserve?" "I do not know," Lyra said honestly. "Justice, perhaps, but I do not know what that looks like." He smiled, and it was a sad expression, full of old grief. "Neither do I. I have had 10 years to think about it, and I am no closer to an answer." "Why were you imprisoned?" The question escaped before she could stop it, and she tensed, expecting anger. But he only sighed, a sound like wind through empty rooms. "For being what I am," he said. "For being different. For having power that frightened those who thought themselves powerful. They called it preventive justice, locking me away before I could do the things they imagined I might do. But you did nothing wrong. Not then, but they did not care. Fear is its own justification." He turned to look at her, and in the firelight his eyes seemed less dark, more human. "Do you know what the worst part was? Not the chains, not the darkness, but the forgetting. The way they spoke of me as if I were already dead. A cautionary tale. A monster in a story to frighten children. I became what they needed me to be, and the truth stopped mattering." Lyra understood that better than she could say. She, too, had been made into something by other people's needs. The obedient servant. The invisible girl. The convenient scapegoat. Identity was not always something you claimed. Sometimes it was something forced upon you, and fighting it only made the chains tighter. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "Why? You were not the one who imprisoned me." "No, but I am sorry that it happened, that the world is the way it is." He regarded her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are an unusual woman, Lyra." Hearing her name from his lips was strange. She had grown so used to being called girl or servant or nothing at all. Her name felt like something forgotten, suddenly remembered. "You know my name." "I know many things," he said. "The walls have ears and the darkness has eyes. I have been listening for a long time." It should have been unsettling, but somehow it was not. "What is your name?" she asked. "Your real name, not what they call you." He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then quietly, "Kaelin. My name is Kaelin." "Kaelin," she repeated, testing the shape of it. It was a good name, strong and old, the kind of name that belonged to legends. "What will you do now, Kaelin?" "I do not know," he admitted. "I came up from the darkness thinking I wanted vengeance, that I would make them pay for what they took from me. But now—" He trailed off, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Now I find myself hesitating. Because of me? Perhaps, or perhaps because vengeance is easier to desire than to execute. In the dark, it was simple. Good and evil. Victim and villain. But the light complicates things." He moved to the window, looking out over the castle grounds. "Tell me, Lyra, if you could leave this place, would you?" "I do not know where I would go." "Anywhere. Everywhere. The world is larger than this castle." She thought about it. Really thought about it. "I suppose I would like to see the ocean," she said slowly. "I have heard it described, but I cannot quite picture it. Water that goes on forever. That seems impossible." "It is real," he said. "And it is beautiful. Terrible and beautiful, like all powerful things." He turned back to her. "I could take you there, if you wanted." The offer hung in the air between them, fragile as glass. "Why would you do that?" "Because you freed me when you had no reason to. Because you speak to me as if I am a person, not a monster. Because—" He paused, searching for words. "Because I am tired of cages, and I think you are too." Lyra's heart was beating too fast. The possibility he offered was dizzying, terrifying, impossible. To leave, to see the world, to be free. But freedom was not simple, and she knew it. "If I left with you, they would hunt us." The Duchess would not allow it. She would send soldiers, mercenaries, anyone she could find. "Let them try." There was no arrogance in his voice, only certainty. He was not a man who feared soldiers, but Lyra was, and she knew what happened to people who defied the powerful. They were made into examples, warnings, stories to keep others in line. "I need to think," she said. "Then think," he replied. "But do not take too long. The Duchess is not a patient woman, and patience is not her only virtue she lacks." Lyra stood, her legs unsteady. The conversation had shifted something inside her, rearranged pieces she had thought were fixed in place. "I should go. They will be expecting a report." "Tell them whatever you need to," Kaelin said. "I will not hold it against you." She nodded and moved toward the door, but paused before opening it. "Thank you," she said, "for speaking with me, for treating me like a person." "Yes. You are welcome, Lyra, and thank you for the same." She left the tower with her mind churning. The guard escorted her back to the lower levels in silence, and she was grateful for it. She needed to think, to process what had just happened, but her thoughts were a tangle she could not unpick. Kaelin had offered her freedom, but freedom came with a price. It always did. The question was whether she was willing to pay it. The Duchess was waiting in the same parlor when Lyra returned. Her expression was expectant, hungry for information. "Well?" "He will not return to the chamber," Lyra said. It was not quite the truth, but it was close enough. "He says he has done his time in the dark." The Duchess's face hardened. "Then we have no choice. We will have to force him." "That will not work," Lyra said more boldly than she felt. "He is too strong. Your guards cannot hold him." "Perhaps not by force," one of the advisors said thoughtfully. "But there are other methods. Poison in his food, a blade in the dark. Even monsters can be killed if one is clever about it." The words sent ice through Lyra's veins. They were planning murder, calm as discussing the weather. And they would do it, she realized. They would kill him and call it justice, and no one would question it because he was the monster and they were the righteous. She had to warn him. But how? She was being watched, she was certain of it. Any attempt to return to the tower would be noted, reported, used against her. She needed to be careful, to be smart, to be patient. But patience had never been a luxury afforded to people like her. That night, long after the castle had gone to sleep, Lyra lay awake in the small room she shared with 3 other servants. They slept soundly, exhausted from the day's labor, but sleep eluded her. Her mind raced with plans and possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. She could do nothing and hope Kaelin's power was enough to protect him. She could try to warn him and risk being caught. She could run, leave the castle entirely, and let whatever happened happen without her. None of the options felt right. All of them felt like betrayal in one form or another. The decision when it came was not rational. It was a feeling, a pull in her chest that felt almost like hunger. She needed to see him again. Needed to tell him what she had heard. Needed to... something. She did not have words for it, but she knew it was true. Moving as quietly as she could, Lyra slipped from her bed and dressed in the dark. The castle at night was a different creature, all shadows and echoes, and she moved through it like a ghost. She knew the paths that avoided the guards, the corridors where the floorboards did not creak, the shortcuts through the servants' passages that the nobility had long forgotten existed. The North Tower loomed before her, darker than the surrounding darkness. She climbed the stairs with her heart in her throat, half expecting to be stopped at any moment. But no one came. The castle, it seemed, was too confident in its power to imagine a mere servant might defy it. The door to Kaelin's room was ajar. She pushed it open and found him by the window again, as if he had not moved since she left. But he turned immediately when she entered, and there was something in his expression that looked almost like relief. "You came back," he said. "I had to warn you," Lyra said, breathless from the climb and from fear. "They are planning to kill you. Poison or blades or something worse. You cannot stay here." Kaelin was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I suspected as much. Fear always turns to violence eventually." "Then you have to leave. Tonight. Now." "And you?" he asked. "What will happen to you when I am gone?" Lyra had not thought that far ahead. "I will manage. I always have." "That is not an answer." He crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she could feel the cold that radiated from him like winter air. "They will blame you, punish you, possibly kill you. You know this." "Yes." "Then come with me." The offer again, but this time it felt different. More urgent, more real. "I cannot," Lyra said, though the words felt like lies. "I have nowhere to go. No skills, no money, no—" "You have courage," Kaelin interrupted. "You have kindness. You have a strength most people never find. That is more than enough." "You do not know me," Lyra said, but her voice was weak. "I know you freed a monster because you thought it was right. I know you risked everything to warn me when you could have stayed silent and safe. I know you see me as a person when the rest of the world sees a nightmare. That tells me everything I need to know." Lyra felt tears prickling at her eyes, hot and unexpected. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever seen value in her beyond her labor. It was overwhelming, terrifying, wonderful. "If I go with you, there is no coming back." "No," Kaelin agreed. "There is not. But would you truly want to? This place has given you nothing but suffering. Why would you mourn leaving it?" He was right. She knew he was right. The castle had been her prison as much as the lower chamber had been his. The only difference was that her chains were invisible, made of poverty and powerlessness instead of iron. But they were chains all the same. "The ocean," she said quietly. "You said you would take me to see the ocean." Kaelin smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger, almost mortal. "I did, and I will, if you say yes." Lyra took a breath, deep and shaking. This was insane, impossible. Everything she had been taught told her to refuse, to bow, to accept her place. But that voice was not hers. It belonged to the Duchess, to the castle, to a world that had never cared whether she lived or died. And she was tired of listening to it. "Yes," she said. "I will come with you." The word hung in the air like a bell ringing, clear and final. Kaelin's smile widened and he offered her his hand. His skin was cool to the touch, but not unpleasant. More like marble that had been kept in the shade. "Then we leave now," he said, "before they have a chance to stop us." "I have nothing to bring," Lyra realized. "No possessions? No. You have yourself. That is enough." They left the tower together, moving swiftly and silently through the sleeping castle. Kaelin led the way, and Lyra marveled at how easily he navigated the darkness, as if he could see what she could not. They passed the great hall, the kitchens, the servants' quarters. Each step took them closer to the outer walls, to the gates that stood between them and the world beyond. The gates were guarded, but Kaelin dealt with that problem in a way Lyra did not fully see. One moment the guards were there, alert and armed. The next they were slumped against the walls, unconscious but breathing. He had not hurt them, she realized. He could have, but he had chosen mercy. The gates opened with a groan of old metal, and then they were through, out into the night and the forest that surrounded the castle. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soft with mud, and the air smelled of wet earth and growing things. Lyra had been outside the walls before, but only briefly. Always under supervision, always with the knowledge that she would have to return. This was different. This was freedom, raw and terrifying and real. They walked for hours, putting distance between themselves and the castle. Kaelin moved with inhuman stamina, never tiring, but he kept his pace slow enough that Lyra could match it. When dawn began to lighten the sky, he led them to a small cave hidden among the rocks, sheltered and dry. "We will rest here," he said, "and continue when night falls again." Lyra sank to the ground, exhausted but exhilarated. Her feet ached, her dress was torn and muddy, and she had no idea what would happen next. But she was free. For the first time in her life, she was free. Kaelin sat across from her, his back against the stone, his eyes on the cave entrance. "Are you well?" he asked. "I think so," Lyra said. "I am not sure. This does not feel real." "It will," he promised, "in time." She looked at him, this strange man who had been buried alive and emerged unchanged, who had chosen her out of everyone in that cursed castle. "Why me?" she asked. "Why did you care? I am nobody, nothing." Kaelin's gaze shifted to her, intense and serious. "You are not nothing, Lyra. You never were. The world tried to convince you otherwise, but that does not make it true." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I was in the darkness, I listened. To the servants, to the guards, to the nobles above. And I heard your voice. Quiet, yes. Unnoticed by most, but kind. Even in a place that rewarded cruelty, you remained kind. That is rare. That is valuable. That is why." Lyra did not know what to say. The words filled something in her she had not known was empty. "Thank you," she whispered. "Rest now," Kaelin said gently. "You are safe here. I will keep watch." And despite everything, the strangeness of her companion, the uncertainty of her future, the danger that surely followed them, Lara found that she believed him. She curled up on the cave floor, using her arm as a pillow, and within moments, sleep claimed her. When she woke, it was to darkness again. Kaelin was still there, exactly as he had been, unmoving as a statue. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, disoriented. "Most of the day," he replied. "It is nearly dusk. We should move soon." Lyra sat up, her body stiff and sore, but rested. "Where are we going?" "South," Kaelin said. "To the coast, as I promised." "How far is it?" "Several days' journey. Perhaps a week, depending on how quickly we can travel." He stood, offering her his hand to help her up. "We will need to find you better shoes and food. I do not need such things, but you do." The practicalities of their escape had not occurred to Lara. She had been so focused on the act of leaving that she had not thought about what came after. "I have no money," she said. "I have means," Kaelin replied. "Do not worry." They set out as the sun disappeared below the horizon, walking through forests and fields that Lyra had never seen before. The world was so much larger than she had imagined, full of sounds and smells and sights that made her head spin. Kaelin walked beside her, sometimes ahead. always aware of their surroundings in a way that suggested centuries of practice. They stopped in a small village the next night, where Kaelin somehow procured food, sturdy boots, and a warm cloak for Lyra. She did not ask how. Some questions she was learning were better left unasked. They did not linger, moving on before anyone could take too much notice of them. The days blurred together. Walking, resting, walking again. Lyra's body hardened to the journey, her soft servant's hands developing calluses, her legs growing stronger. And with each step away from the castle, she felt something inside her unclenching, loosening. The fear that had lived in her bones for so long began, slowly, to ease. Kaelin was a strange companion. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words were thoughtful, measured. He told her stories of the world as it had been before his imprisonment, of cities that had risen and fallen, of wars fought and won and lost. He spoke of beauty and horror with equal calm, as if both were simply facts of existence. "You have lived a long time," Lyra observed one night as they rested beneath the stars. "Yes," Kaelin agreed. "Does it ever become too much? Living?" He considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. There are stretches where the weight of years feels unbearable. Where I wonder what the point is, continuing on when everything I have known turns to dust." He looked at her, but then something changes. Something new appears. A person, a place, a possibility I had not considered. And the world becomes bearable again. "Is that what I am?" Lyra asked quietly. "A reason to keep going?" "Perhaps," Kaelin said. "Or perhaps you are something more." She did not know what he meant by that, and she did not ask. Some truths, she sensed, needed time to reveal themselves. On the 7th day, they crested a hill and Lyra smelled it before she saw it. Salt and brine and something wild. And then there it was. The ocean. Vast and grey and moving like a living thing, stretching to the horizon and beyond. She had never seen so much water, had never imagined such an expanse. It made her feel small and significant all at once. "It is real," she breathed. Kaelin stood beside her, his expression soft. "Yes, it is real." They descended to the beach and Lyra walked to the water's edge, letting the waves lap at her boots. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar and whisper, and the wind tasted of salt. She felt tears on her face and did not wipe them away. "Thank you," she said to Kaelin, though the words felt insufficient. "You freed me," he replied. "It is I who should thank you." They stood there together as the sun set over the water, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold and purple. And for the first time in her life, Lyra felt something she had no name for. It was bigger than happiness, deeper than relief. It was the feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. The days that followed took on a different rhythm. They found a small cottage near the coast, abandoned but sturdy, and made it their own. Kaelin needed little, a place to shelter from the sun during the day, but he made sure Lyra had what she needed. Blankets, food, a fire to keep her warm. They settled into a strange domesticity, two people learning to exist in the same space. Lyra spent her days exploring the coastline, collecting shells and watching the waves. She taught herself to fish using a line and hook Kaelin procured. And though she was clumsy at first, she eventually caught enough to feed herself. She felt useful in a way she had not in the castle, where her labor had benefited everyone but herself. Here, every task she completed was for her own survival, her own comfort. It was empowering. Kaelin spent his nights walking the beach or sitting on the rocks staring out at the water. Sometimes Lyra joined him, and they would talk about everything and nothing. He told her more of his past, of the family he had lost centuries ago, of the loneliness that came with outliving everyone you loved. She told him of her childhood, what little she remembered, of her mother's kindness, and the harshness that had followed her death. "Do you regret it?" Lyra asked one night. "Coming with me instead of taking your revenge?" Kaelin was quiet for a long time. "No," he said finally. "Revenge would have been empty. It would not have given me back what I lost. But this..." He gestured to the ocean, to the cottage, to her. "This feels like something real. Something worth having. Even though it is small, quiet. Especially because it is small and quiet," Kaelin said. "I have had enough of grand gestures and dramatic declarations. I am content with this. Lyra smiled. I am glad. But peace, she was learning, was a fragile thing. And the world had a way of finding people who tried to hide from it. The soldiers came on a moonless night, silent as shadows. Lyra woke to the sound of boots on the porch and knew immediately that their time here was over. She sat up, heart pounding, and saw Kaelin already at the window, his body tense. How many? She whispered. 6, he replied. Maybe more in the trees. The Duchess sent them. Of course she did. Lyra felt fear, yes, but also anger. They had been happy here, safe. And the world could not allow it, because happiness and safety were privileges reserved for those who already had power. What do we do? She asked. Kaelin turned to look at her, and in the darkness, his eyes seemed to glow faintly. I will deal with them. You stay here. No, Lyra said, surprising herself. I am not hiding while you fight alone. Lyra, I am done hiding, she said firmly. If they want to take me back, they will have to do it with me fighting. Kaelin studied her for a moment, then nodded. Very well, but stay behind me. He moved to the door and opened it before the soldiers could break it down. The leader, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, stepped forward. By order of the Duchess, you are to return to the castle. Both of you. No, Kaelin said simply. The soldier's hand went to his sword. This is not a request, nor is my refusal. What followed was swift and brutal. The soldiers attacked, and Kaelin met them with a speed and strength that was inhuman. He moved like water, like smoke, like something that could not be touched. Swords passed through empty air where he had been moments before. Men fell, unconscious or disarmed, but not dead. Kaelin was careful, even in violence, not to kill. Lyra watched from the doorway, clutching a fire poker she had grabbed as a weapon. She felt useless, but she was there, and that mattered. One soldier broke away from the group and lunged toward her, and she swung the poker with all her strength. It connected with his arm, and he cursed, dropping his weapon. Before he could recover, Kaelin was there, placing himself between them. Do not touch her, he said, and his voice was ice. The soldier retreated, clutching his arm, and within minutes it was over. The soldiers lay scattered around the cottage, groaning but alive. Kaelin stood in the center of them, breathing hard, not from exertion, Lyra suspected, but from restraint. This will not be the last time, he said quietly. They will keep sending people until one of us is dead. Then we keep running, Lyra said. For how long? A month, a year, a lifetime. Kaelin looked at her, and there was something broken in his expression. I am tired of running, Lyra. I have been running in one way or another for centuries. Then what do you suggest? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the unconscious soldiers. Then softly, we end it, we go back. And we make them understand that we are not theirs to control. It was a dangerous idea, possibly a suicidal one. But Lyra found herself nodding. All right, she said. We go back. They left the cottage behind, taking only what they could carry. The journey back to the castle was shorter than the journey away had been, perhaps because Lyra knew the destination now, or perhaps because she was walking towards something rather than away from it. They arrived at dawn just as the sun was breaking over the horizon. The castle looked the same, cold, imposing, eternal, but Lyra felt different. She was not the same girl who had left. That girl had been a slave. This woman was something else. The gates were closed, but Kaelin opened them with a gesture, the metal bending to his will. They walked through unchallenged, past guards who froze at the sight of them, too shocked or too frightened to act. Word of their arrival spread like fire, and by the time they reached the great hall, the Duchess was waiting. She stood on the dais where the throne sat, surrounded by her advisors and guards. Her face was a mask of fury and fear, and when she spoke, her voice shook. You dare return here after fleeing like criminals? We are not criminals, Lyra said, her voice steady. And we are not running anymore. You released a prisoner. You defied my orders. I freed a man who was unjustly imprisoned, Lyra interrupted. And I would do it again. The Duchess's eyes blazed. You will be executed for this. Both of you. No, Kaelin said quietly. We will not. He stepped forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The guards reached for their weapons, but Kaelin held up a hand, and they froze, unable to move. It was not violence. It was simply power, undeniable and absolute. You imprisoned me because you feared what I might do, Kaelin said. But in all the time I have been free, I have hurt no one who did not attack me first. I have taken no revenge, sought no retribution. I have simply lived, and yet you pursue me still, because my existence challenges your control. You are a monster, the Duchess spat. Perhaps, Kaelin agreed. But what does that make you? You who would kill an innocent girl to punish me? You who built your power on the suffering of those beneath you? He looked around the hall at the nobles who had gathered to watch. I am done being your scapegoat, your cautionary tale, your excuse for cruelty. From this moment on, I am free, and so is she. He took Lyra's hand and she felt the warmth of his touch despite the cold that radiated from him. Together they turned and walked toward the doors. Stop them! The Duchess screamed, but no one moved. The guards, the nobles, the servants, all stood frozen, not by Kaelin's power but by their own uncertainty. The world they had known was crumbling, and they did not know what would replace it. Lyra and Kaelin left the hall, left the castle, and did not look back. Behind them, they heard shouting, confusion, the sounds of a power structure realizing it had lost its foundation. But they did not stop. They walked through the gates, down the road, toward the horizon where the ocean waited. Where will we go now? Lyra asked as the castle disappeared behind them. Anywhere, Kaelin replied. Everywhere. The world is ours to explore. Lyra smiled, feeling the sun on her face and the wind in her hair. She was free. Truly, completely free. And the future, uncertain as it was, felt like a gift. They walked in silence for a while, letting the miles stretch between them and their past. The road ahead was long and unknown, but that did not frighten Lyra anymore. She had survived the castle. She had survived the journey. She would survive whatever came next. Kaelin, she said after a time. Yes, thank you. For everything. He squeezed her hand gently. Thank you, Lyra, for seeing me when no one else would. And in that moment, walking side by side toward an uncertain future, Lyra understood something fundamental. Freedom was not a place. It was not the absence of chains or the presence of choice. Freedom was this, walking beside someone who saw you as you truly were, and choosing to keep walking, no matter what lay ahead. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth and casting long shadows behind them. Somewhere in the distance, birds sang. The world was vast and full of possibilities, and for the first time, Lyra felt ready to meet them. Not as a servant, not as a slave, but as herself. Whole and unafraid. They would face challenges, she knew. The Duchess would not give up easily, and there would always be those who feared what they could not control. But Lyra was no longer the girl who flinched at shadows. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. And she had learned that sometimes, the quietest acts, opening a door, speaking a truth, choosing kindness, could change everything. The road wound through forests and fields, past villages and rivers, always leading forward. Kaelin walked with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, and Lyra walked with the eagerness of someone discovering it for the first time. They were an odd pair, the immortal and the mortal, the powerful and the powerless made powerful. But they fit together in a way that made sense only to them. As evening approached, they stopped to rest by a stream. Lyra drank deeply from the cool water while Kaelin sat on a fallen log, watching the forest with ancient eyes. "Do you ever wish you were mortal?" she asked him suddenly. He considered the question. Sometimes, mortality gives life urgency meaning. When you know your time is limited, every moment becomes precious. He looked at her. But immortality has its own gifts. The ability to witness change, to learn endlessly, to be present for moments of great beauty. He paused. And to meet people worth knowing across centuries. "Am I worth knowing?" Lyra asked, half teasing, half serious. "You are," Kaelin said without hesitation. "You are brave and kind and true. Those qualities are rare in any age." Lyra felt warmth spread through her chest. "You are worth knowing too, Kaelin. I hope you understand that." They rested until nightfall, then continued their journey under the stars. The moon rose full and bright, illuminating the path ahead, and Lyra felt a sense of peace she had never known before. This was what freedom felt like. Not the absence of hardship, but the presence of choice. The ability to decide her own path, make her own mistakes, find her own joy. Days turned into weeks. They traveled south, then east, following no map but their own desire. They saw mountains that touched the clouds and deserts that stretched forever. They met people who were kind and people who were cruel, and they learned from both. Lyra discovered strengths she had not known she possessed: resourcefulness, resilience, a fierce determination to protect what mattered to her. And what mattered to her, she realized, was walking beside her every night. His presence as constant as the stars. They spoke of many things during their travels: philosophy and history, dreams and regrets. Kaelan shared stories of his long life, the triumphs and tragedies, the loves lost and found and lost again. Lyra listened, absorbing every word, understanding that he was giving her something precious: trust, vulnerability, his true self. In return, she gave him what she could: her laughter, her curiosity, her unwavering belief that he was more than what others had made him. She challenged his pessimism with her hope, his cynicism with her wonder, and slowly she saw him change. The hardness in his eyes softened. The weight he carried seemed to lighten. "You have saved me," he told her one night, as they sat by a campfire beneath unfamiliar constellations. "Not by freeing me from that cell. That was only the beginning. You saved me from myself, from the bitterness that would have consumed me." "You saved me too," Lyra replied, "from a life that was not living, from believing I was nothing." They looked at each other across the flames, and something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition, a bond that went deeper than words could express. Eventually they returned to the coast, to the ocean Lyra had fallen in love with. They found a different cottage this time, farther from civilization, nestled in cliffs that overlooked the sea. It was wild and beautiful, and theirs. They built a life there, simple but full. Lyra tended a garden and learned to make things with her hands: pottery, woven baskets, things that were useful and beautiful. Kaelan explored the night, returning with stories and sometimes gifts: shells, driftwood, once a pearl he had found in the shallows. They spoke and they were silent, and both felt equally right. Seasons changed. Lyra grew older, her hair showing threads of silver, her hands developing the creases of age. Kaelan remained unchanged, eternal and untouched by time. It should have been sad, the disparity between them, but somehow it was not. They both understood that their time together, however long or short, was a gift. "Do you fear death?" Kaelan asked her one evening as they watched the sunset. Lyra thought about it. "I fear pain," she admitted, "and I fear leaving you alone. But death itself? No. I have lived more in these years with you than I did in all my years before. If death comes, it will find me satisfied." "You will not be alone when it does," Kaelan promised. "I will be there. I will hold your hand and ease your passage, and I will remember you, Lyra. For as long as I exist, I will carry you with me." Tears ran down Lyra's cheeks, but they were not sad. That is all I could ask for. They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in impossible colors. The ocean roared below them, eternal and indifferent and beautiful. And Lyra thought about how strange life was, how unexpected. She had been born into servitude, had expected to die in it, but she had found courage in the darkest place, had freed a prisoner and been freed in return. She had seen the ocean, had loved and been loved, had lived. Years passed. Lyra's body grew frail, but her spirit remained strong. Kaelan cared for her with a tenderness that belied his fearsome reputation, and she let him, grateful for every moment. When she could no longer walk to the ocean, he carried her there. When she could no longer tend her garden, he tended it for her, learning which plants she loved most and making sure they thrived. And when the end came, it was gentle. She lay in their cottage with Kaelan beside her, holding her hand as he had promised. The ocean sang its eternal song beyond the window, and Lyra smiled. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "Thank you, Lyra," Kaelan replied, his voice thick with emotion she had never heard from him before. "You gave me something I thought I had lost forever. Hope, joy, love. You gave me reasons to keep living." "Then keep living," Lyra said. "For both of us. See all the things we did not have time to see. Love all the sunsets. Remember that the world can be beautiful, even when it is cruel." "I will," he promised. I will remember. Lyra closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand, hearing the ocean, content. And when her last breath left her, it was not with fear but with peace. Kaelin stayed with her until dawn, holding her hand, honoring the woman who had changed everything. Then, gently, he laid her to rest, overlooking the ocean she had loved, in a place where the wind and the waves would sing to her forever. He did not leave immediately. He stayed by the ocean for a long time, watching the tides come and go, remembering every conversation, every smile, every moment of joy they had shared. Lyra had been mortal, brief as a candle flame in the vast darkness of his existence, but she had burned bright, and her light had shown him truths he had forgotten. Eventually, he walked away from the cottage, back into the world. He carried her memory like a treasure, and whenever he felt the weight of his immortality becoming too much, he remembered her words. Keep living. See all the things we did not have time to see. And he did. He traveled to distant lands, witnessed wonders and horrors, met people who reminded him of her in small ways. He helped when he could, protected the powerless, spoke truth to power. He became not the monster they had feared, but something else, a wanderer, a guardian, a keeper of stories. And always, always, he remembered Lyra. The servant girl who had freed a prisoner. The woman who had taught an immortal what it meant to live. Centuries passed, and the castle that had held them both fell to ruin. The Duchess and her court turned to dust, their names forgotten. But Kaelin endured, carrying Lyra with him in every step, in every choice, in every moment of kindness he showed to those who needed it. Because she had shown him that power was not about control or fear. It was about choice, about using strength to protect rather than dominate, about seeing the humanity in others even when the world insisted they were less. He never forgot her. Not in 100 years, not in 1,000. She remained with him, a constant presence. Proof that one life, however brief, could change eternity. And sometimes, when he stood by the ocean and watched the waves crash against the shore, he could almost hear her voice in the wind. Keep living, she seemed to say. Remember that the world can be beautiful. And he did. For her, for himself, for all the Lyras of the world, trapped in cages they did not choose, waiting for someone to see them, to free them, to remind them of their worth. The world turned, seasons changed, and Kaelin walked through it all, immortal and alone but never quite lonely. Because love, he had learned, did not end with death. It transformed, becoming something eternal, woven into the fabric of who you were. Lyra had loved him not for his power or his immortality, but for himself. And that love had given him something no amount of time could provide. Purpose. He would live as she had asked. He would witness beauty and fight cruelty. He would remember her in every act of courage, every moment of kindness, every time he chose light over darkness. Because she had taught him that freedom was not just the absence of chains. It was the presence of choice, the courage to be true to yourself, the strength to love even when love brought pain. And that was worth an eternity. The decades that followed Lyra's death were both punishment and privilege. Kaelin walked through them with the careful attention of someone who had learned that every moment mattered, even when you had infinite moments to spare. He did not return to the ruins of the old castle, though he heard it had crumbled entirely, swallowed by ivy and time. The Duchess had died bitter and alone, her name remembered only as a footnote in histories no one read. The servants who had once trembled in those halls had scattered to other lives, and the world had moved on, as it always did, indifferent to the dramas of the past. But Kaelin did not move on. He carried Lyra with him like a second heart, feeling her presence in the choices he made, the paths he took, the people he helped. He had promised to keep living, and he did. But living was different now. It had shape and purpose where before it had been merely endurance. He traveled east first, following trade routes and rumors, seeking places Lyra had mentioned wanting to see. There were cities of gold and spice, markets that smelled of cinnamon and cardamom, temples carved into mountainsides where monks chanted prayers that sounded like the ocean. He saw them all, and in seeing them, he imagined what she would have said. How her eyes would have widened at the sight of elephants draped in silk, How she would have laughed at the chaos of a crowded bazaar. How she would have stood silent and reverent before ancient sacred spaces. In a city built on canals, where buildings rose from water like dreams made solid, Kaelin encountered a young woman being sold in a marketplace. She could not have been more than 16, her wrists bound, her eyes empty of hope. The merchant proclaimed her virtues: strong back, obedient nature, good teeth, as if she were livestock. The crowd barely glanced at her, too accustomed to such transactions to register horror. Kaelin stopped. He looked at the girl, and she looked back, and in her face he saw Lyra. Not literally. This girl had dark skin and darker eyes, features from a different corner of the world, but the expression was the same: the resignation, the quiet acceptance that her life belonged to others. He approached the merchant. How much? The transaction was brief. Kaelin paid twice what the merchant asked, which caused suspicion but not enough to refuse the sale. The girl was handed over and Kaelin led her away from the market, through winding streets to a quiet courtyard where a fountain sang. He removed her bindings. "You are free," he said in her language, which he had learned decades ago. "You may go wherever you wish." The girl stared at him, uncomprehending. "Free? Yes, but who will I belong to?" The question pierced him. "Yourself," Kaelin said gently. "You belong to yourself." He gave her coin enough to start a new life. Directions to a sanctuary run by women who helped those fleeing bondage, and watched as she walked away, glancing back repeatedly as if expecting him to change his mind. He did not follow. That was not his role. He could open doors, but she had to choose to walk through them. It became a pattern. In every city, every village, every forgotten corner of the world, Kaelin looked for cages. Sometimes they were literal. Prisoners held unjustly, slaves bound by law or custom, children trapped in situations not of their making. Sometimes they were invisible, people imprisoned by poverty, by fear, by the expectations of others. He could not free everyone. The world was too large and injustice too common, but he freed who he could. And in each act of liberation, he felt Lyra's hand in his, guiding him. He was careful never to draw too much attention. Immortality required discretion. He moved between identities like changing clothes, becoming a merchant in one city, a scholar in another, a hired sword when necessary. He accumulated wealth through patience, investments that matured over decades, treasures found in places others had forgotten. Money, he learned, was a tool, and tools could build or destroy depending on who wielded them. The years became centuries. Empires rose and fell. Languages evolved and died. Technology transformed the world in ways that would have seemed like magic to the people of Lyra's time. Kaelin adapted, always adapting, learning that immortality was less about living forever and more about learning to let go. He made friends and watched them age. He loved sometimes, though never with the depth he had loved Lyra. Those relationships were gentler, more careful, bounded by the knowledge that they would end. He did not marry, did not have children. How could he when he would outlive them all? The grief would have been unbearable, but he was not entirely alone. Over the centuries, he encountered others like himself, not vampires. That word had always been imprecise, a label humans applied to things they feared, but beings who existed outside normal time. Some were kind, others cruel, most simply tired. They formed no community, no councils or hierarchies. They were too solitary for that, too shaped by their individual eternities. But they recognized each other, and sometimes they would share a meal or a conversation, trading stories of the ages they had witnessed. One such being was a woman named Mirella, who claimed to have walked the earth since before humans learned to write. She had skin like polished mahogany and eyes that had seen civilizations birth themselves from mud and ambition. Kaelin met her in a library in Alexandria, not the ancient one which had burned, but a modern institution built on its memory. "You are different from when I last saw you," Mirella observed, studying him across a table laden with books neither of them truly needed to read. "Softer, more human." "Is that a criticism?" Kaelin asked. "An observation." She smiled, and it was warm. "What changed you?" He told her about Lyra, about the servant girl who had freed him from more than just a cell, about the years they had shared and the promise he had made. Mirella listened without interruption, and when he finished, she nodded slowly. "Love is dangerous for creatures like us," she said. "It gives us something to lose, and loss is our oldest enemy." "Yes," Kaelin agreed. "But it also gives us a reason to continue. Without it, what is immortality but an endless repetition?" "Wisdom," Morella said approvingly. "You have learned what many of our kind never do. That eternity without meaning is its own kind of death." She paused, considering. "There is something you should know. A gathering is being called, in the mountains of the north where the old powers still linger. Others like us coming together to discuss the changing world." "I do not attend such things," Kaelin said. "Perhaps you should. The world is shifting faster than ever before. We cannot hide forever in the margins. Decisions will be made that affect us all." Kaelin was skeptical, but Morella's words stayed with him. He had avoided the politics of immortals for centuries, preferring to walk his own path. But perhaps she was right. Perhaps isolation was no longer sustainable. He traveled north to mountains that touched the sky, where snow fell eternal and the air was so thin that mortals could barely breathe. The gathering place was a fortress carved from the mountain itself, ancient beyond reckoning, built by hands that had turned to dust millennia ago. Inside, perhaps 30 beings had assembled, each one carrying the weight of centuries in their eyes. The discussions were heated. Some argued for greater intervention in human affairs, believing that with their power came responsibility. Others advocated for complete separation, for hiding so thoroughly that humans would forget they existed. A few, the darkest voices, suggested domination, that beings of their power should rule rather than hide. Kaelin listened more than he spoke, but when the conversation turned to whether humans were worth protecting, worth caring about, he could not remain silent. "I have lived among them for longer than most of you," he said, his voice cutting through the debate. "I have seen their cruelty and their kindness, their capacity for destruction and creation. They are flawed, yes, mortal, yes, but they are not less because of it. In some ways, they are more." "More?" One of the others, a man who called himself Draken, sneered. "They are mayflies, here one moment, gone the next. What can they possibly offer us?" "Everything," Kaelin replied. "They offer urgency, passion, the ability to change in a single lifetime what it takes us centuries to consider. And they offer perspective. When you know your time is limited, you make it matter." He thought of Lyra, of her courage in the face of overwhelming power, of her kindness in a place that rewarded cruelty. "I knew a woman once," he continued. "A human woman, a servant, powerless by every measure the world uses. But she changed me more profoundly than all my centuries of existence had. She taught me that power without compassion is meaningless. That freedom is not the absence of chains, but the choice to break them, for yourself and for others." The room was silent, then Morella spoke. "And what would you have us do, Kaelin?" "I would have us remember," he said. "Remember that we were human once, most of us. That we loved and feared and hoped as they do. And I would have us use our power not to rule or to hide, but to protect. To be guardians, not gods." The gathering ended without consensus, as such things often did. But Kaelin's words resonated with some, and in the decades that followed, he found allies. Beings like himself who chose to use their immortality in service of something larger than themselves. They did not form an organization, they were too independent for that. But they communicated, coordinated, helped where they could. Kaelin returned to his wandering, but with renewed purpose. He found himself drawn to places of conflict and suffering, not because he sought them out, but because Lyra's voice in his memory would not let him look away. In war-torn regions, he smuggled refugees to safety. In places of famine, he used his wealth to buy food and distribute it quietly. In cities where injustice flourished, he became a whispered legend, the stranger who appeared when hope was lost, who helped and then vanished. He was careful never to be seen as supernatural. Humans feared what they could not understand, and fear led to hunting. Instead, he presented himself as human, using his resources and his knowledge to make a difference. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he failed, but he tried, and that was what mattered. The centuries rolled on. He watched humanity stumble towards something resembling enlightenment, though the path was neither straight nor smooth. He saw revolutions overthrow tyrants only to become tyrants themselves. He saw empires built on oppression crumble and new ones rise to take their place. He saw moments of breathtaking beauty, art, and music and literature that captured something essential about existence, and moments of horrifying darkness that made him question whether humanity deserved to survive. But always, he remembered Lyra's faith. She had believed in kindness even in the cruelest place. She had chosen hope when despair would have been easier. And if she could do that in her brief mortal life, he could honor her by doing the same across his immortal one. In the early years of the 20th century, Kalen found himself in a city being torn apart by war. Buildings crumbled under bombardment and the streets ran with blood and rain. Most immortals fled such places. Why risk yourself in mortal conflicts? But Kalen stayed. There were people who needed help, and he had learned long ago that need mattered more than safety. He worked with a group of volunteers running a makeshift hospital in a basement. The doctor in charge was a woman named Eleanor, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, who asked no questions when Kalen appeared with medical supplies that should have been impossible to procure. She simply put him to work, and he labored alongside her and the other volunteers, carrying wounded, cleaning instruments, holding hands of the dying. One night, during a brief lull in the shelling, Eleanor sat beside him on the basement steps. They were both exhausted, covered in blood and dust, and she offered him a cigarette, which he declined. "You are different from the others," she said, lighting her own. "How so?" "You do not flinch. No matter how bad it gets, no matter what you see, you remain steady. I have seen soldiers break under less." "I have seen worse," Kalen said quietly. "It was the truth, though not the whole truth." "Where?" "Many places, many times." Eleanor studied him through the smoke. "How old are you, really?" It was a dangerous question, but Kalen found himself answering honestly. "Older than I look." She laughed, a brief, bitter sound. "Aren't we all?" She took another drag. "I have been doing this work for 30 years. Every war, I think it will be the last. That humanity will finally learn. But we never do we?" "No," Kalen agreed. "But you keep trying anyway. What choice do I have? If people like us stop trying, then the darkness wins." It was an echo of Lyra's philosophy, and Kalen felt that familiar ache in his chest. "There is always a choice," he said. "You could leave. Save yourself. No one would blame you." "I would blame me." Elena crushed out her cigarette. "Besides, where would I go? This is my city. These are my people. I may not be able to save them all, but I can save some. And some is better than none." When the war finally ended, Kalen stayed long enough to see the hospital re-established, to watch Eleanor continue her work with the same fierce dedication. Before he left, she gave him a small photograph, herself and her staff smiling despite everything. "So you remember us," she said. "I will," he promised. And he did. He kept that photograph for decades, a reminder that heroism was not about grand gestures or supernatural power. It was about showing up day after day and doing what needed to be done. The 20th century brought changes even Kalen had not anticipated. Technology accelerated at a pace that made previous centuries seem frozen in amber. Information spread instantly across the globe. Humans developed weapons that could destroy the entire world. And they developed medicines that saved millions. It was progress and peril in equal measure, and Kalen navigated it with the caution of someone who had seen promising advances turn catastrophic. He adapted his methods. Where once he had worked in person, now he could work through networks and organizations. He funded research into diseases that killed the poor. He supported movements for justice and equality. He used the tools of the modern world to amplify the work he had done alone for centuries. But he never forgot the personal touch. Technology could distribute resources, but it could not hold a hand or offer comfort. So he still walked among humans, still looked for the moments where his presence could make a difference. In a refugee camp in Africa, he met a girl named Amara who reminded him painfully of Lyra. She had the same quiet strength, the same refusal to be broken despite circumstances that would have crushed most. She had lost her family to violence, had walked hundreds of miles to reach the camp, and now spent her days teaching younger children to read using scraps of paper and charcoal. Kalen arranged for her to receive a scholarship to a school far from the conflict. He watched from a distance as she excelled, became a teacher herself, and eventually returned to her homeland to build schools where none had existed. She never knew who had helped her, never knew that the anonymous benefactor who had funded her education had been moved by the memory of a servant girl who had lived centuries before. But Kaelin knew, and in knowing, in seeing Lyra's spirit alive in Amara and in countless others who chose kindness over cruelty, hope over despair, he felt his promise fulfilled again and again. The 21st century arrived with its own challenges. Climate change threatened the world in new ways. Political divisions deepened. But there were also moments of extraordinary progress. Diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia were eradicated. Information became accessible to nearly everyone. Voices that had been silenced for generations found platforms and audiences. Kaelin watched it all, participated where he could, and tried to maintain perspective. He had seen dark ages and renaissances, collapses and recoveries. Humanity's story was not linear. It was a spiral, sometimes ascending, sometimes descending, but always moving. He thought often of what he would tell Lyra if he could, about the wonders she would have marveled at. Flying machines that crossed oceans in hours, devices that let you speak to anyone anywhere, medical miracles that would have seemed like magic, and about the sorrows that would have broken her heart, wars that killed millions, injustices that persisted despite progress, the stubborn human capacity for cruelty. But mostly he thought she would have been proud of what he had done with his immortality. He had not become the monster they had feared. He had not taken revenge or sought power. He had tried every day to honor her memory by being worthy of the freedom she had given him. And on quiet nights, when he stood by the ocean, for he always returned eventually to the ocean, he could almost hear her voice in the waves. Keep living. Remember that the world can be beautiful. He did. He would. For as long as eternity lasted. The years continued their relentless march, and Kaelin found himself drawn to new patterns of existence. He had learned that immortality was not about experiencing everything. That was impossible, even with infinite time, but about finding the threads that connected moments across centuries. He began to see humanity not as individuals flickering in and out of existence, but as a great continuous story, each person adding their verse before passing the page to the next. In the mid-21st century, he found himself in a coastal city that had not existed when Lyra was alive. It was built of glass and steel, soaring towers that caught the light and threw it back at the sky. The ocean lapped at its foundations, and on clear days you could see for miles across the water. It was beautiful in a way that would have been incomprehensible to someone from Lyra's time. And yet Kaelin thought she would have loved it. The ocean was still the ocean after all. Some things remained constant. He had taken an apartment high in one of the towers, a space of clean lines and windows that framed the sea. It was a luxury, perhaps unnecessary for someone who could sleep anywhere, or not sleep at all. But he had learned that beauty mattered, that surrounding yourself with things that pleased the eye and the spirit was not vanity but sustenance. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant oranges and purples, there was a knock at his door. Unexpected. Few people knew where he lived, and those who did knew better than to arrive unannounced. Kaelin opened the door to find Mirella standing there, looking not a day older than when he had first met her centuries ago. "May I come in?" she asked. Of course. She entered, moving to the windows immediately, drawn by the view. "Magnificent. I sometimes forget how beautiful this world can be." "What brings you here?" Kaelin asked, bringing her tea, a ritual he had learned from a dozen different cultures, adapted and refined over centuries. "A proposition," Mirella said, accepting the cup. "Or perhaps a warning. It depends on your perspective." Kaelin waited, patient. Immortals rarely rushed. "There are young ones," Mirella continued, "newly made, newly aware of what they are. And they are angry. They see humanity's flaws, and there are so many, and they believe they could do better. They speak of ruling openly, of using their power to force humanity onto a better path." "That never ends well," Kaelin observed. "No, but they are young enough not to know that yet, young enough to believe they are different, that they will succeed where others failed." She sipped her tea. "Some of us believe they need to be taught, guided, shown another way. And I thought of you." "Why me?" "Because you have lived among humans without becoming either their master or their victim. Because you have found a way to use your power that does not corrupt. Because you loved one of them so deeply that you built your entire existence around honoring her memory. Mirella set down her cup. They need to see what you have become, to understand that there is an alternative to domination or isolation. Kaelin was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink into the ocean. He thought of Lyra, of her belief that change came not through force but through choice. That you could not make someone free, they had to choose freedom for themselves. "I will speak with them," he said finally, "but I cannot promise they will listen." "No one can promise that," Mirella said, "but we must try." The meeting was arranged in a neutral location, an island in the Pacific, small and uninhabited, where the only sounds were waves and wind. Kaelin arrived to find 5 young immortals waiting. They ranged in apparent age from late teens to early 30s, but all carried themselves with the arrogance of those who had recently discovered their power. They looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. He was old, yes, but what had he done with all those centuries? Where were his monuments, his empire, his legacy? "Thank you for meeting with us," said one, a young man who called himself Nero. "Though I am not certain what we have to learn from someone who hides among mortals like a hermit." "I do not hide," Kaelin replied calmly. "I choose. There is a difference." "A choice to waste your power," another said. "A woman named Selene. We could change this world. End war, end hunger, end suffering. But instead what? Help one person at a time? Save a few when you could save millions?" "Could I?" Kaelin asked. "Could any of us? Humans must choose their own path. We can guide, assist, inspire. But ruling them? Forcing them onto the path we think best? That only creates resentment and rebellion." "Pretty words," Nero scoffed. "But the world is burning. Climate collapse, political chaos, inequality that grows worse each year. They are failing, and we could fix it. How?" Kaelin's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath it. "By revealing ourselves? By demanding obedience? And when they resist, because they will resist, what then? Do you kill those who defy you? Imprison them? Control their minds?" He shook his head. "That is not salvation. That is tyranny." "Sometimes tyranny is necessary," Selene argued. "A firm hand to guide them until they learn. And who decides when they have learned enough? You?" Kaelin looked at each of them in turn. "I have lived long enough to see many who believed themselves benevolent rulers. They all started with good intentions. They all ended in blood. You offer criticism but no solution," Nero said. "The world needs saving. If not by us, then by whom?" "By them," Kaelin replied. "Humans save themselves generation after generation. They stumble, yes. They fail, yes. But they also triumph. They solve problems we could never have imagined. They create beauty that takes our breath away. They love and sacrifice and endure. Our role is not to save them, but to support them in saving themselves." "That is cowardice," Selene said flatly. "Perhaps," Kaelin agreed. "Or perhaps it is wisdom. I knew a woman once who taught me that freedom cannot be given. It must be taken. That you cannot force someone to be better, you can only show them the possibility and let them choose." He paused. "She was human, mortal, powerless by your standards. But she changed the world more than any of us will because she changed it from within, person by person, choice by choice." "One person changing a few people," Nero said dismissively. "What impact does that have against the forces that shape history?" "Every force that shapes history is made of individual choices," Kaelin replied. "Empires rise because thousands choose to follow. They fall because thousands choose to resist. Change the individuals, and you change everything." The debate continued for hours, and Kaelin found himself thinking of Lyra throughout. What would she say to these young immortals? How would she, with her gentle strength, her quiet certainty, respond to their arguments? He tried to channel her spirit, to speak not with the authority of centuries, but with the compassion of someone who had seen suffering and chosen kindness anyway. By the time the moon rose, he had not convinced them, not entirely, but he had planted seeds of doubt, had made them question their certainties. Mirella, who had observed from a distance, approached him as the young ones departed. "Well done," she said. "I changed nothing," Kaelin replied. "You changed their thinking, made them consider alternatives. That is all anyone can do, she smiled. You are becoming what you were meant to be, Kaelin. Not a ruler, not a warrior, but a teacher, a guide. I am only repeating lessons I was taught, he said, thinking of Lyra. That is what all good teachers do. They pass forward the wisdom they received. Morella placed a hand on his shoulder. She would be proud of you. After she left, Kaelin stood on the beach, letting the ocean's spray mist his face. He thought about legacy, about what immortals left behind. Not monuments or kingdoms, those crumbled with time, but ideas, values, the ripples of choices made centuries ago that still moved through the world. Lyra had been dead for over 200 years, her bones long returned to the earth, but her influence lived on. In him, yes, but also in every person he had helped because of what she taught him. In Amara and her schools, in the refugees he had sheltered, in the countless small acts of kindness and courage he had supported or inspired. The ripples spread outward, touching lives she would never know, in times she could never have imagined. That was immortality. Not the persistence of flesh, but the persistence of impact. Kaelin returned to his tower by the sea, but he found himself restless. The conversation with the young immortals had stirred something in him, a sense that passive assistance was no longer enough. The world was changing so rapidly now, accelerating toward futures both wondrous and terrible. He needed to do more. He began to work more actively with humans who were trying to make a difference. Climate scientists struggling to be heard. Activists fighting for justice. Teachers in underfunded schools. Doctors in forgotten regions. He offered resources, connections, sometimes just encouragement. He did not reveal what he was. That would only complicate things. But he made himself useful. One project consumed him particularly. A young woman named Kira had developed technology to clean polluted water using sustainable methods. It was brilliant, revolutionary, but she lacked the funding to scale it. Kaelin provided that funding anonymously, and within 5 years her invention was deployed in dozens of communities. He attended the ceremony when she won a major award, standing in the back of the hall, watching her speak about bringing clean water to millions. She never knew he was there. That was fine. The work mattered, not the recognition. But occasionally, he let people see him. Not as an immortal, but as a human who cared. He volunteered at homeless shelters and refugee centers. He sat with the dying in hospices, offering what comfort he could. He tutored children in neighborhoods where education was an afterthought. And in these small, direct interactions, he felt closest to Lyra. This was the work she would have done, if she had lived. Years passed, then decades. The young immortals Kaelin had spoken with went their separate ways. Some embraced his philosophy, choosing to work quietly among humans. Others rejected it, attempting to establish themselves as leaders or rulers. Those experiments always ended badly. Humans had a talent for toppling would-be gods. A few of the young ones died, destroyed by humans or by other immortals who saw them as threats. Kaelin mourned each death, even those who had scorned his advice. They had been young, and youth deserved the chance to learn from mistakes. He encountered Nero again, decades after their first meeting. The young immortal looked diminished, worn in a way that had nothing to do with age. He had tried to rule a small region, presenting himself as a prophetic leader. It had ended with mobs and fire, and Nero had barely escaped. "You were right," Nero said simply. They were sitting in a cafe in a city neither had visited before, anonymous among the crowds. "I did not want to believe it, but you were right. They do not want to be saved. Not by us." "No," Kaelin agreed, "but they want to save themselves. And sometimes they want help doing it. Is that enough for you? Helping from the shadows, never being recognized?" Kaelin thought of Lyra, remembered but unknown to the world. "Recognition is not why I do it. Then why?" "Because someone once showed me that power without compassion is empty. That freedom is a gift you give yourself by freeing others. That the smallest life can have the largest impact." He looked at Nero. "And because I promised someone I would keep living, keep trying, keep believing the world can be beautiful even when it is cruel." Nero was quiet for a long moment. "I envy you," he said finally. "Having someone like that, something to anchor you." "You will find your anchor," Kaelin said. "It takes time, but you have time." They parted as something closer to friends than they had been, and Kaelin continued his wandering, his work, his endless attempt to honor a promise made in the shadow of the ocean. The world kept changing. New technologies emerged that would have seemed miraculous to previous generations. Humans began to cure diseases that had killed billions over the centuries. They created art forms that did not exist when Kaylin was young. They reached beyond their world, touching other planets, dreaming of stars, but they also continued old patterns. Wars still erupted over resources and ideologies. Inequality still divided the powerful from the powerless. Fear still led to cruelty. The fundamental struggles remained, just dressed in new clothes. Kaylin did what he could. He learned to code and used those skills to protect vulnerable systems. He invested in green energy and sustainable agriculture. He supported candidates who prioritized justice over power. Small actions, perhaps, in the face of massive challenges. But Lyra had taught him that small actions accumulated, that you could not judge impact by immediate results. On the 300th anniversary of Lyra's death, a date only he marked, Kaylin returned to the place where they had lived together, the cottage by the sea. It was gone, of course, erased by time and storms. The coastline itself had changed, the rocks rearranged by centuries of waves. But the ocean was the same, the eternal ocean. He stood where the cottage had been and spoke to her memory. Told her about the world she had missed, the wonders and horrors. Told her about the people he had helped, the lives changed, the ripples still spreading from that moment when she had opened an iron door. He told her he was tired sometimes, that immortality was a burden as much as a gift, but that he kept his promise. He was still living, still trying, still believing. The waves crashed against the rocks, indifferent and eternal. But Kaylin felt her presence anyway, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. She was there in his memories, in his choices, in every act of kindness he performed because she had shown him how. "Thank you," he whispered to the wind, "for everything, for showing me what matters, for giving me purpose, for loving me when no one else could see past the monster." The ocean roared in response, and Kaylin smiled. He would keep going, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because the world, for all its flaws, was worth the effort, because Lyra had believed in him, and he would not betray that belief. He turned from the ocean and walked back into the world, ready to continue his endless work. There were people who needed help, cages that needed opening, freedoms that needed defending. And he had time, all the time in the world. As the sunset painted the sky in colors that would have delighted Lyra, Kaylin felt something he had not felt in decades. Not happiness exactly, something deeper. Contentment. The sense that his existence had meaning, that his immortality was not a curse but an opportunity. To witness, to help, to remember, to love. And to keep Lyra's memory alive, not through monuments or histories, but through action, through being the kind of person she had believed he could be. That was his eternity. Not the passage of years, but the persistence of purpose. And it was enough. If this story found a reflection in you, leave a comment and share it. Sometimes the quietest pain is the most human.